So Human Rights Watch has been sending a delegation to Tokyo to talk to the Japanese government about its foreign policy, in particular for Israel-Palestine, asking Japan to use its influence with the United States to get the United States to suspend weapons transfers to the Israeli military, given the real risk that those weapons will be used to commit abuses against Palestinian civilians. We're also glad that the Japanese government has ties with Iran, and we're asking it to do the same thing, to urge Iran to stop funding Hamas and Islamic Jihad, both of whom are also committing war crimes. So one concern is that the war crimes that the Israeli military is committing against Palestinian civilians in Gaza is not only devastating for those civilians, 34,000 people at least have been killed there since October 7th, the vast majority women and children. So that's terrible for people living in Gaza. But U.S. backing for that kind of unlawful series of attacks is undermining U.S. credibility across the world. And Japan has such a principled approach to international law, saying that the laws of war, for example, should be obeyed everywhere, in Ukraine, in Sudan, as well as in Israel-Palestine. And so we think that the Japanese government has an interest in upholding the rules-based order, in having consistency in the global human rights system, making sure that we're not selective in deciding whose human rights we care about. We know that the Japanese government has a very strong alliance with the United States government, and that's important to Japan, that kind of credibility. And so if Japan cares about U.S. credibility, it could be a good friend and ask the United States to stop undermining its own credibility, as well as the credibility of the global human rights system by supporting the Israeli military in unlawful attacks against Palestinian civilians. Another thing the Japanese government can do is to publicly express support for the work of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, both of which are engaged on Israel-Palestine. Again, the United States has been undermining the work of the International Criminal Court, asking the prosecutor not to investigate Israeli war criminals, even while it's encouraging the court to investigate Russian war criminals. So that doesn't work. You can't be against war crimes against Ukrainians, but not against war crimes against Palestinians. And we believe that Japan relies on the rules-based global order, including in addressing some of the security concerns it has for China. But that rules-based order is undermined by selectivity. And that's why we're asking Japan to take a strong statement in favor of a universal application of human rights protections. So I'm in charge of research globally for Human Rights Watch. We have researchers working in more than 40 countries across the world, documenting abuses in 100 countries across the world, doing so through a principled position that everybody's human rights need to be respected, and the same rules apply to everybody. I started my career as an Israeli human rights lawyer. I co-founded an organization that promotes the right to freedom of movement for Palestinians in Gaza. Pretty quickly, it became clear that the problem that Palestinians in Gaza were facing was not just legal, not just individuals who were unable to travel, for example, to access medical care or reunite with family, but also much broader. And so I developed skills as a researcher and advocate to also change some of those policies. And then when I came to work for Human Rights Watch, and I eventually joined Human Rights Watch with a global portfolio, which has been really nice because human rights are not just abused in Israel-Palestine. Unfortunately, they're abused around the world. And when you work as part of an organization that is able to address issues globally, you have more power. Because you can, for example, use examples of unlawful uses of weapons in Gaza as a way to get governments to sign on to pledges to limit unlawful uses of weapons globally through treaties and other means. Human Rights Watch won a Nobel Prize for its work against landmines, for example, based on research in different countries that we pulled together. So it gives you the ability to have a voice. So on October 7th, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, together with others from Gaza, carried out war crimes against Israeli civilians in southern Israel, massacring families, burning people alive in their homes, and taking civilians hostage. Those are war crimes, and we are about to complete a comprehensive report documenting what happened, its systematic nature, and calling for accountability. And that's particularly important because we believe that there are unlawful ways of using violence. And what Hamas and Islamic Jihad did on October 7th was unlawful. And we've also been documenting Israeli war crimes against Palestinian civilians in Gaza and advocating for their end. So we have teams of researchers documenting unlawful strikes on civilian buildings and civilians in Gaza, including targets like hospitals. We've been documenting also the Israeli military using starvation as a weapon of war by blocking aid from entering Gaza and leading to famine-like conditions in which in northern Gaza 1/3 of children are acutely malnourished as a result of the food shortages. We document those crimes and then we advocate for them to end, including with the United States government, which is exercising a lot of control, and also in international fora like the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, both of which are looking into the situation in Gaza. So we've been providing evidence to the International Court of Justice. South Africa has brought a case against Israel under the Genocide Convention, and we've provided research documenting deliberate restrictions of humanitarian supplies into Gaza, which is part of South Africa's case. We've also been advocating for countries around the world, including Japan, to protect the independence of the International Criminal Court. Both the Israeli government as well as the US government have been pressuring the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court not to issue arrest warrants against Israeli potential criminals. And we believe that it's actually quite important for the International Criminal Court prosecutor to act because we need something to rein in that conduct, certainly by Israeli military officials, but also by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Yeah, so both Gaza and the West Bank have been in a very difficult situation since October 7th, as have civilians in southern Israel. So in Gaza, one of the first things the Israeli military did was close the crossings into Gaza, not letting people in or out, and blocking humanitarian aid, and including things like drinking water and electricity and fuel. Since then, Israel has been allowing a trickle of aid into Gaza, but in the 7 months since the start of the war, that has led to very big shortages of food and very basic medicines. So you have hospitals trying to cope with more than 78,000 injured people, in addition to everything else that happens in a population, without fuel, without anesthesia, operating on children without pain medication. You have families who spend their entire day trying to get food. And in northern Gaza, they've been eating animal food because there is no food. We've seen children experiencing severe wasting as a result of the shortages. All of that together with massive use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And for the last 7 months, the Israeli military has dropped very heavy explosive weapons on Gaza, which is densely populated. That's expected to cause massive civilian casualties, and it has caused massive civilian casualties. More than 35,000 people have been killed in Gaza since October 7th, the vast majority women and children. And just to give you a sense of it, if somebody were to drop very large numbers of explosive weapons on the city of Tokyo, it doesn't matter what they're trying to hit. It is expected that they will kill lots of civilians. That's what's been happening in Gaza every day for the last 7 months. One thing to keep in mind is that in Gaza there are 2.3 million people, nearly half of whom are children. So for the last 7 months, the Israeli military on average has killed nearly 70 children every day through this massive use of explosive weapons. And one of the things that Human Rights Watch has been doing has been documenting unlawful attacks and then going back to the countries who are providing the weapons and asking them to stop doing that, because they risk being complicit in those abuses, in that killing of children, if they continue to supply the weapons.